Welcome to the Gerald Brooks School of Leadership, where we are redefining leadership by training, equipping, and building leaders through transformational leadership teaching. This is the School of Leadership.
I'm doing a remake of a book. The book's no longer in print. I've had people run up to me and say, hey, can I find it online? But you can find books that have this title, but you can't find this particular one. And a part of it is it's dated, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But the book was entitled this, Why Smart People Do Dumb Things. Why Smart People Do Dumb Things. Now, this particular book, I found it at the Atlanta airport. I was flying in. I think I was going to speak at a university there, and I had some extra time, and if you want to just give me joy, let me look at a book, and I just find that being fun, and I find it being fulfilling. But I was looking through because every region has local authors that some bookstores will carry that aren't carried nationally. And I picked this book up because the title intrigued me. Why Smart People, so we're assuming that they're smart, do dumb things. And then I opened up the book, and it didn't tell you who the people were at first, but it gave you scenarios. And the scenarios were current history, and that's why the book isn't out today, because the history is so dated that back then it would have fit, but today it wouldn't fit. But in there, it gave scenarios, and it said, do you believe that someone who had these characteristics about them that would make this decision? And you're scratching your head, and you're saying, there's no way in the world, there's no way anyone would do that. And so, as a result, I began to pick this book up, and it really challenged me because, one, will just write me down as someone who has an ego. I think I'm smart. But I've also lived long enough to watch smart people do things that are head scratchers, and you're just thinking, wow, how in the world did they do that? So it began to list some of the qualities of dumbness, of when a leader does dumb, what that looks like, and what leads to that leader doing dumb. And so, because this book impacted me at that time, and of course my journey was different, and I was a lot younger at that particular time when I was taking this venture and picking up that book, I was reading it again, just sort of skimming it, and I thought, some of these things are worthy of being talked about. So I want to walk you through why smart people will do dumb things. The first one is, people do dumb things when they take those that they're leading for granted. See, all of us lead somewhere, and all of us lead someone. We all lead ourselves. We also know that we all lead other people, and so just in your family, with your kids, whatever your work scenario is, there is some degree of leadership there. But leaders get themselves in trouble when they take the people they're supposed to lead for granted. Because at that point, what happens is values are lost and the people become victims. They become victims. So the values are lost of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And now I take the people for granted, and whenever I lose my value of who the people are, I turn the people into victims. See, you can walk away from a lot of things, but you can never walk away from your values. You can never make a good deal with a bad person. And if you become that bad person, you're never going to make good deals. So here's my basic value, and here's the value that I believe that every leader should have. What can I do to make your life better? That's my question. I remember, I serve on John Maxwell's board, and John and I were at a meeting together, and I turned to John and I just looked at him. I said, "What can I do to make your life better?" And he looked at me. He said, "That's a Gerald Brooks question. No one else would ask that question. They would be asking, what can John Maxwell do to make Gerald better?" But see, my value is that I believe that I'm to contribute to you, that I'm to add to you, that I'm to make your life better, that I'm to do something that elevates you, that causes you. But if I lose that value, then you become a victim of what I'm thinking. I've lived my life based on a premise. When you become a leader, you lose the right to think about yourself. That is the value that I've led on for 46 years. It's the reason in John Maxwell's book, 21 Irrefutable Laws, the Law of Sacrifice, it's quoted there. Because it moved John. See, most people think when you become a leader, you think about yourself. But when you become a leader, you lose the right to think about yourself. Now, you put yourself in a room where you're thinking about other people more than you're thinking about yourself, and you stand out. You'll never have a lack of people reaching out to you. You'll never have a lack of influence with people because you're looking at them and you're saying, okay, I have a responsibility. In financial terms, they call it a fiduciary responsibility. I have a fiduciary responsibility to make everyone's life that I come in contact with better. That's my job. But I believe it's every leader's job. But if you lose your values, your platform becomes about you. And how many leaders do we need to watch who've made their platform about them before we just say, that can't be what leadership is? See, if you lose your value in business, it's take the money and run mindset. It's SoFi Bank in California when all of the executives knew that the credit spread no longer worked for the bank. They all knew it. They knew that there was no way that based on their long-term investments and the percentage of interest rates they were going to get, that they were going to be able to give the interest rates that people were wanting today. And if they kept giving that, there was no way that the bank could stay solvent. But do you know what all the executives did? They cashed out their stock. They just said, hey, I'm going to look out for me. I'm going to protect me. I'm going to sell my stock even though I know my stock is going to be worth nothing tomorrow. Because what I know personally, everyone's going to know publicly. That the infamous camel letter that the FDIC is going to send out that's supposed to be confidential is not going to be confidential because there's going to be a run on the bank. Now, in life, it looks like Boeing when the 737 MAX had 3 crashes with experienced pilots. And everyone knew that there was a flaw with the plane. Well, it was a software flaw. Everyone knew that if you put in a certain number of signals that there was going to be a flaw, but Boeing wouldn't admit it. But you know what was worse than not admitting it? They never apologized for it. When nearly 500 people die because of a faulty software plan that they have, and they know it's there, and they know that pilots have to be trained, but they never pull and say, we're not going to let that plane fly again until we can upgrade this software, but they never apologize. It was all for one reason. It would hurt our stock prices. See, whenever people get lost in the values, they become victims. In history, it's Margaret Thatcher, one of the greatest leaders of Britain. She was a remarkable leader. But the thing about her was, the more that she led, the longer she led, she lost sight of the people she was leading. And what had been one of the most vivid illustrations of leadership, at the very end, was people didn't trust her. Because she went from serving them to them serving her. It's Rehoboam in the Bible. That's Solomon's son. That after Solomon dies, Rehoboam begins to ask the elders, said, what can I do for the people? And the elders said, why don't you relax this and do this and give them a break? But then he listened to the young people, and the young people around him said, no, you need to be harder, you need to be harsher. And so he became very hard and he became very harsh. And then what happened? The kingdom of Israel that had 12 tribes is going to go down to one tribe. 11 of them are going to leave. It's the reason that you're going to have Israel and Judah. You're going to have the division, all because a leader began to lose sight of the people. And it's in church when ministers think ministry's about them. You know, I speak to a lot of ministers and a lot of young ministers, and everyone's into a video on their entire, journey. And so you have this sort of up-to-date Instagram kind of, TikTok kind of thing where they're posting all the time. They're seeing everything they do, wherever they're at and everything. But I tell young pastors, I said, you understand that your video crew cannot go into the throne room. There's no video crew in the throne room. It's all about God. And anytime you let this thing become more about you than Him, then you cease to be effective as a leader. The greater the scrutiny, the more integrity is required. The larger the platform, integrity is needed. Another thing, people do dumb things when no one can tell them no. Now, right now in your life, there may be dozens of people who can tell you no. But if you really start making it in a leadership, people will not want to tell you no. But what we know is that biblically, everyone needs to be submitted to someone. When Jesus met the centurion who was coming for help for his servant, the centurion uttered these words. He says, I'm a man with authority and I'm a man under authority. And Jesus said, I've not found so great a faith. And what he was recognizing was someone who understood the legitimate platform of authority, that if you have authority, you need to be under authority. That no one gets to be the rogue. No one gets to be the renegade. No one gets to be. I tell the story that one day, the time we had just built that, so it was probably around 1996, the original. There's been 7 different phases to building out what we have today. But it was in phase 1, and I'm in my office, and I get a call, and it's the front desk telling me that Deion Sanders wants to talk to me. Well, Deion Sanders at that time, was still active in football, active in baseball. He was, he was everyone's athlete of athletes. But he literally lived 3 streets down from here. Now, I didn't know Dion, so I just thought they were pulling my leg. And I said, he's not. And they said, Pastor, he's out here, he wants to talk to you. And I said, okay. So I go out, and lo and behold, Dion's sitting there. And he says, Pastor, I've heard about you. Can I talk to you? I said, sure. We go back in the back. Now, Dion had just given his heart to Christ. And Dion looked at me, he said, I have a problem. And I said, well, what is it? And he says, well, I've been asked to go speak at a church. And I said, great. He said, but I've never prepared a message before. How do you do that? Would you help me do that? And I said, well, Dion, I'd be thrilled to help you write a message. I said, it's pretty easy. But I said, before I do, I said, I need to know who can tell you no. I said, you have the three things that most Christians want. You have fame, you're good looking, and you have money. I said, you have what most Christians think everyone should get it. But you had it before you were a Christian. People knew you, people stared at you, and you had money. And I said, I'm not going to help you unless someone can tell you no. So I said, who can tell you no? And he gave me a name. I said, well, if he can tell you no, give me his number. And I called him. I said, I'm sitting here in front. If you tell him no, will he stop? I didn't say that there are people who tell you no, but when they tell you no, you stop. Who you stop for? Lo and behold, guy said, yeah. I said, tell me a story. And he told me a story. I said, okay. So I ended up saying, okay, Dion, I'm going to write a 4-point message for you. I said, I'm going to base it on football. We're going to do this because I said, everyone's going to know that you know football. And I'm going to give you 4 principles, and I'm going to give you 4 verses to tie it in. But then you're going to put a football story with it. You're going to make it personal. So we did that. I didn't hear from Dion for 2 weeks. And I said, Dion, when he left, I said, I'd just like you to call me and let me know how it went. Because I was invested now. I'd helped him write the sermon. All he did was contribute the stories. And I didn't hear from him. Finally, 2.5 weeks later, he calls me. He said, Pastor, do you want to come over to my house? He said, you know, my chef's here, and I'll have him make whatever you want. Well, I'd never been to a house where there's a chef, where they make whatever you want. I mean, I just had never had that offer. I said, well, let me think about it. I said, I'm available. I wasn't interested in Dion. I was interested in the chef and whatever I want. So it's early, you know, and I want a good Southern breakfast. And I said, hey, this is what I want. The guy says, coming your way. Dion's laying there over on the couch, and he's got his sweats on, and he's looking like he's been drug in from outside. And he said, Pastor, you got to explain something to me. I said, well, what's that? He said, you know, I've done 2-a-days. He played for Florida State. In Florida, in the humidity and the heat. I would then go play baseball because he was a 2-sport, and I've played baseball in the middle of that. But he said, I preached this one weekend twice, and I've never been as tired. I've been exhausted. I couldn't even call you for 2 weeks. He said, can you tell me what happened? Why did this when I could do it? I said, Dion, I said, welcome to the world of ministry. I said, your whole life, all you've had to do is give physical energy. For the first time, you had to give your heart. I said, you just experienced what every pastor feels on Sunday. In history, there was a general, Douglas MacArthur. But he wouldn't listen to President Truman tell him no. And he almost got us into a nuclear war. in Korea because he couldn't. In the Bible, it's Balaam, a man who God told not to do something, but he kept finding the caveats. In churches, you fill in the blanks. I can give you however many names you can give of pastors gone bad. I can make that list 1,000 times longer. And it's usually because someone couldn't tell someone no. They couldn't look at them and just say no. Here's what you need to remember. In leadership, there is a level where accountability is something you choose. It's not something that's enforced. As you grow in your leadership journey, there are going to be things you could get away with and you know you can get away with. You just choose to be accountable in those areas. Another one. People do dumb things when technology advances are not accompanied by character. Someone says, well, what does that mean? When I started in ministry, the only people I could hurt were the people in front of me. Now, everyone in here can hurt people all over the world because of technology. You can create a technology platform where thousands of people are watching you, and people begin to trust you. And then you do something. And what I tell pastors is this: your character has to grow at the rate of your platform. And if it doesn't, all that happens is you hurt more people. Now, I love history. When Abraham Lincoln was running for president, the nation was already divided. There was already this tension because of the issue of slavery. But there was a concern because for the first time there was a technology that was going to allow people in the United States to hear the outcome of the election on the day of the election. It had never happened before. And here was the concern: that people wouldn't have time to process it. Because information had always happened that this man would walk down the street and tell this man, and he would go to this town and he would tell. And there was always this speed of information that was slow. But now it was going to be immediate because they had a thing called the telegraph. For the first time, a telegraph was going to be able to send the outcome to every city, every state at the same time. And they questioned whether the emotional capacity of people was strong enough to be able to handle immediate communication. Can you believe there was a day when they thought that about people? And do you know what their second concern was in history? That people could say things on the telegraph that were not true. And they could send out stories that were not so, just to stir up certain groups of people. Can you believe that there was that day? So the question becomes, as technology increases, so much the speed of your development of your character. So every time you get a new upgrade as far as your phone, ask yourself if you're upgrading your heart. Because if your phone's being upgraded with more possibilities than you are, then what you'll get on your phone. That's one of the problems we have today. We have a whole generation of young people that are used to the speed of technology, but they're used to the growth of a snail. And if this generation doesn't help them, they will be overwhelmed outwardly because they haven't grown up inwardly. So in history, it was COVID. Why? Because all of a sudden, everyone had to have technology. The government said, hey, stop every church. Don't meet together. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to go online. But do you know what the internet wasn't prepared for? Every church in America going online at the same time. So we crashed the internet. It was never there. You couldn't handle the bandwidth of every church in America being live at the same time. So what happened the first few weeks? Shut down. It was then that I wrote the governor and I said, we're starting back up. I know you said we can only have 13 people, but that makes us ineffective. I said, here's the deal. Unless you can tell me hell is quarantining, the church is not. Because if hell's still accepting people in, the one group that is supposed to be able to invite people to an alternative location is not going to stop. And I said, here's where it is. The Attorney General got my number and he called me and he said, I want you to watch, we're about to come out with something. I didn't know the Attorney General. But the letter got to him. Because I gave him, I said, these are the 8 things we'll do to open it back up. We were going to be the first church to open back up in Texas. And I just said, hey, come arrest me because I'm not shutting down. Hell's doing its job. The church will do its job. Someone said, well, what are you going to do? You're going to make all those people come to church? I said, if I could make people come to church, I wouldn't have waited till COVID to do that. I said, you obviously haven't been to church because I can't make anyone come. And I said, I'm not concerned with the saved. I'm concerned with the lost. The only people who got mad at me were the Christians. Because it made them have to face up to what their commitments were. So they were upset with me, but that's all right. But the thing about it is that we learned that technology had its own levels of flaws in it. There were things that it couldn't do. And there were things that were unable. Biblically, you have the example of Joshua. God looked at Joshua and he said, when you take this journey, I don't want you to look to the right hand or the left. And see, in Jewish speak, that was very important. The left hand was the hand of dishonor. The right hand was the hand of honor. And what he was saying is, don't let bad things distract you. Don't let good things distract you. Another thing, people do dumb things when they become disconnected from life. Leadership requires connection. You have to be connected to real life. I was listening to a Harvard Business Review podcast, and in there, the lady who was the CEO of Pepsi, she had just been appointed the CEO of Pepsi, and she comes home and her mom's there. And the mom's cooking dinner. And as she's cooking dinner, she needs something from the store. Well, the CEO of Pepsi, the lady, her husband is in the house and is seated over there. And so she comes in and she says, I've got this great news to tell you. And the mom says, I need this and this from the store. And the lady's frustrated. She says, but I'm going to tell you some great news. The mom looks at her and says, you realize when you come home, you've got to leave your crown in the garage. Ultimately, when we do life, we have to lead being connected back to real life. And so she was telling this story, and she said, I walked away from it saying this: even though I was the CEO of Pepsi, I still got to go to the store. The Bible says that Jesus was touched with the feelings of our infirmities. The higher you go in leadership, the easier it is to become insulated. One of the things that is always a trap for presidents because they get insulated is that in some debate, they're going to be asked this: tell us what the price of milk is. I'm going to say, price of milk? Well, everyone in the world probably uses milk. And they'll say, well, I don't know. One president lost the election because he went out and he was at a store and they were using a scanner, you know, where they scan things like that. And he said, when did they start doing that? Anytime you become disconnected, people no longer see you as someone valid to follow. Biblically, it's the Qumran Society. You'll know the Qumran Society because they were the people who took the Red Sea scrolls and all that and hid them in the mountains and everything. But they believe historically when Jesus talked about the people with the 5 talents and said that one group of them had taken their talents and hid them, that it was the Qumran Society. Because they thought to stay pure as Christians, we needed to get away from the world, and they went out in the desert and built their own community that was going to maintain purity. They were going to be isolated. For churches, it's when we think we can get in our holy huddles and not do the main job that we were given, which is to tell the story of Christ. So one of the things we do at this church is something I learned a long time ago. For every 12 hours a group meets, there needs to be 1 hour outside the church for evangelism. Because if all you do is you get in your holy huddle, I asked pastors this question. I said, tell me how many chapters are in the book of Deuteronomy? You know how many pastors have ever answered that for me? None. And I tell them how many are in there. And I said, now I want to ask yourself, now that you know how many chapters are in the book of Deuteronomy, how many lives does that change? How many marriages did it help? How many single moms? I said, God's not against us knowing things, but when we get so consumed with what we know, we no longer do something. So, in your life and my life, we can do dumb things when people can't tell us no, when our character's not growing at the speed of the life around us, when we get disconnected. And it doesn't take much to get you from dumb. Because here's what I've learned about dumb. It's not 7 steps. You can do dumb really quick. No 7 steps. There may be 7 steps in prayer. Dumb can happen really, really fast.